Welcome to Conversations with Barbara. I'm Barbara Kanellopoulos, and my guest is with me today is Quentin Palfrey. He is here to talk about something that's on everyone's mind, and that is the upcoming elections. Will they be fair? Quentin is chair of the Voter Protection Corps, and Quentin, I'll turn to you to tell us what the Corps' mission is.
Sure. So the Voter Protection Corps is a national organization. It's a network of lawyers who have been involved in voter protection issues over the last few cycles. So for me personally, this is my fifth presidential cycle working on voter protection issues. We also have a number of data scientists that we work with to make sure that our interventions are informed by evidence and data, and we're targeting our resources at the most important kinds of problems.
That's such critical work. That's so important. And what is the outlook at this point? What are your concerns about the primary in September and the November election?
Well, I think we've got an unprecedented set of challenges to the integrity of this election. So we have for many years had a system where people of color and younger people who move around a lot, face obstacles that just aren't faced by other folks in this system. And those kinds of problems have persisted and gotten considerably worse in this cycle. So one way to think about that is massive lines in African American communities. We've seen in primary after primary throughout this cycle. In Georgia, we saw them in Philadelphia. We saw them prior to that in Wisconsin. So there's a set of challenges that I think have been deeply embedded in our system for a number of decades. We also have a president who weaponizes lies about voter fraud in order to try to raise obstacles to registering and voting among populations that he believes are going to vote against him. We have foreign adversaries who have interfered in the last election and where there's every reason to believe will interfere with this one. We have a pandemic that has dramatically changed the way that people think about going into public and voting in person. And then we have a president who has signaled that he is likely to contest the integrity of the election if it doesn't go his way. So we got a lot of work on our hands.
Yes.
And not that much time to head off those problems.
Yes. If I was worried before speaking to you, I am really worried now because this is a heavy load. And so is the situation in Massachusetts any easier than it is elsewhere because we now have voting by mail?
So I think that what the legislature did and what the governor signed last week is a step in the right direction. I do think that one of the keys to improving our elections in the time of the pandemic is to make it easier for folks to vote by mail. And so I'm glad that we were able to make some changes in that regard, although I will say there's some shortcomings to that legislation and some things that I think that I wish we had done more of and done better. And there's some threats to the implementation of that legislation. So just today, a number of voting groups sued Secretary of Galvin because of concerns that the legislation will not be fully implemented. And so I do think that we have some work to do here in the Commonwealth. So let's just step back and talk about that legislation. There's some major improvements, as you mentioned, to the vote by mail system. It requires that the secretary mail out mail-in ballot applications to all voters in advance of the primary and then in advance of the general election. And it expands early voting pretty considerably. So I think in both of those respects, it would be a major improvement. The President Trump has repeatedly stated lies and falsehoods about mail-in voting, vote by mail, trying to link it to fraud. But that is very much at odds with what the organizations and researchers who have looked at vote by mail have found. So, for instance, the Brennan Center and the Bipartisan Policy Center have both looked at vote by mail as it's been implemented in a number of elections, and have found that vote by mail is safe, that it is remarkably free of fraud. And that's been the experience of a number of the states that have implemented vote by mail in recent elections. So I was recently talking to the Secretary of State of Colorado, for example, which is a state that has gone almost entirely to vote by mail, and they've had a very good experience. And by the way, it's not just Democrats who vote by mail. So Utah, for example, which is a very red state, has had a very good experience with vote by mail. It has increased turnout in Utah, but it's not Democrats that are voting by mail in Utah. And so it's actually not something that is advantageous to one party or the other, but it is an important piece of the puzzle in terms of making it easier for folks to vote, and particularly easier to vote in a time where we're all trying to social distance, and where a number of the folks who have historically volunteered to support our elections on election day as poll workers are senior citizens who may be particularly at risk of the virus.
So we will then be having some in-person voting. Is that is it that some people simply insist on in-person voting? I wonder about that. So that it won't be entirely by mail. There'll still be in-person voting.
Yeah, that's correct. And, I think that that's the right answer. There are some folks who are going to have difficulty voting by mail, and there are some folks that are going to prefer voting in person. One of the things that we've seen historically is that the folks who are most likely to want to vote in person are actually some of the communities that have faced the greatest challenges and disenfranchisement. So, for instance, the African American community is the community that's most likely to vote in person. That's also true of Native Americans on reservations, for whom the postal system is often not as easy. Young people, homeless people, folks with disabilities. So I think it's really important to have a range of options. The way that we think about it at the Voter Protection Corps is we think it should be an all of the above strategy. So we think that you ought to increase vote by mail options. Certainly that's been a successful strategy throughout the pandemic. It's been a successful tool in a lot of states in the western part of the US for the last couple cycles. But we also think you ought to be able to expand early voting options. Early voting options are important for folks who maybe they have jobs, maybe they have child care obligations, maybe they have other kinds of challenges that make it harder to vote during a narrow window of time on election day. And then we think that there ought to be robust in-person voting options. And one of the things that we're most concerned about, if you look at the primaries that have happened since the beginning of the pandemic, you often do see very long lines. And you particularly see long lines in communities of color. And so I think that it's important that we look at what's causing those lines, and we take steps now, 4 months in advance of the general election, to head off those challenges. And that's going to mean recruiting more poll workers. That's going to mean trying to avoid too many polling place closures, and it's going to mean communicating really clearly with voters about what their options are.
So we're talking then about having volunteers, younger poll workers, to replace those who are vulnerable to the virus, and so those notices ought to be going out so that people can begin to volunteer.
I think you're absolutely right, Barbara. That's completely the right answer. So, if you think about how many people we need to staff the polls across the country, it's about 900,000 people, which is about the same scale as the decennial census. So every 10 years, we recruit almost 1 million people to knock on doors and collect census forms. And we need about that number of people to be available for acting as poll workers on election day. Historically, more than 50% of the people who have worked as poll workers are over the age of 60. There are particular concerns within this population that are going to make it more difficult for some of those folks and are going to make it more difficult to recruit from among those communities. And so you're absolutely right that one of the main strategies is going to be to try to find potentially younger people. We could give them, say, civics credit in high schools or in colleges. We could come up with other kinds of incentives, but I think we ought to be looking to a number of different strategies for getting folks interested in volunteering or in some cases being paid to be election workers on election day. We also ought to think about polling places. So in the last election, we had about 116,000 polling places across the country. And one of the things that's been happening during the pandemic, during the primaries, is there's been a lot of pressure to close a lot of those polling places. So to take an egregious example, in the city of Wisconsin, in the city of Milwaukee in Wisconsin, on election day, primary day, they went from 180 polling locations in the previous presidential primary down to just 5. When you decrease the number of polling locations, what you're likely to do then is increase the lines. So what we saw in Milwaukee was a huge number of voters, and this was a disproportionately African-American community, had to wait in line 4, 5, 6 hours. And then a number of them contracted the virus because they were not social distancing, and it created a public health risk. So we need to decrease the number of poll closures. If polling places need to be moved, so for instance, if it's in a senior center or a nursing home, there may be times where we want to change a polling location, but we should move it rather than close it. So the city of Philadelphia just last month closed 77% of their polling locations. So if you leave open only 23% of your polling locations, you're going to get lines. And if you get lines, that has the effect of suppressing the vote and also creates a very risky situation for the people who do want to vote in person.
Now, can we assume that the closing of those polling stations was intentional?
So in some states, we have seen the closing of polling locations be an intentional voter suppression strategy. So one example I would give is in 2018 in Georgia, the Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, was running against Stacey Abrams. It was a very close election, and it was likely the number of the African-American voters were going to vote for Stacey Abrams. The Secretary of State running for governor seems to have taken a strategic approach to polling place closures, where not only did he close a number of polling places, but he tended to close the polling places that were closest to the African-American communities. So if you had a particular county, it previously had several polling places, some of the polling places were closed. Very often the ones that were closed were the ones in the African-American communities, the ones that were left open were the ones in the white communities. And if the African-American voters had transportation difficulties, that was another obstacle to voting. So sometimes these polling place closures can be a strategy for voter suppression, but in a lot of instances, there are budget constraints. There are administrative struggles. There may even be some well-meaning folks who think that, because of the pandemic, there are difficulties in making certain physical locations safe. In our study, we recently put out a study on some of these issues called Keep the Polls Open, which we can share the link with your readers or your viewers. But we found that a very small percentage of polling places, only 2 to 3% of polling places, are in the kinds of locations that are just sort of intrinsically inappropriate. for use during a pandemic. So we probably don't want to have folks voting in nursing homes or in senior centers under any circumstances. But the vast majority of these polling places could be made safe and should be made safe. But if you're going to close them, you want to replace them, move them, as opposed to just shut down the number of voting locations. And you want to be really clear with voters about what the changes are. So, a lot of us are used to voting in the same locations year after year. So if that's going to be changed, you need to be very proactive with voters to communicate to them what the new circumstances are going to be.
Are you seeing some movements in that direction across the country? It is already July. Time is short.
I think you're entirely right, Barbara, that time is short. And I think we have a lot of work to do to make sure that people understand the importance of keeping polling places open, make sure that groups are focused on this challenge of recruiting enough polling workers for Election Day. It's certainly a project that we at the Voter Protection Corps are undertaking to help with a number of states in their efforts to recruit poll workers. But it's a massive effort, and we need more folks to be involved. And by the way, the process of recruiting poll workers in most states is a nonpartisan one. There are some states that take a certain number of Democrats and a certain number of Republicans, but in most places, this is a nonpartisan effort. And something that groups who are just interested in making sure that elections function fairly can engage in without getting involved in the political aspects of things.
Is the Corps doing any work about voters who are disenfranchised for various reasons? That we hear that the rolls are very often people's names are taken off if they haven't voted for a couple of elections. And is that part of the Corps' mission?
It certainly is, and what you're talking about falls under the broader heading of voter purges. And every state does a certain amount of work to keep its rolls current, and in some circumstances, it does make sense to take people off of the rolls. But we have seen those processes be done in a way that's unfair, or in a way that has a tendency to disadvantage certain populations. There are a lot of groups that are doing voter purge chase programs, which I think is a very good strategy. So it is generally a matter of public record whose names have been taken off of various rolls. And if the voter registration period is still open, what groups do sometimes, not our group, but there are a number of other groups that are doing this, I think it's great work, is reach out to the voters who have recently been taken off the rolls and say, did you know that your voter registration was just revoked? Here's how you can re-register. And that can head off problems down the line, because a lot of times what ends up happening, different states have different rules, but a lot of times what ends up happening is that those folks then are asked to file a provisional ballot, and in some cases, those provisional ballots aren't counted. And so it is a way that people are disenfranchised. And it raises an important issue for us here in Massachusetts, which is that we have a very antiquated voter registration system. So a number of states, 21 states and the District of Columbia, have enacted something called Election Day registration, which means that you can register to vote right up to and including Election Day. And in Massachusetts, we disenfranchise the people who don't register to vote beyond the cutoff. And this is a very antiquated system. It's something that should have been fixed. And as a result, there are a number of voters who are qualified to vote, qualified to register, whose votes aren't counted because of bureaucratic and unnecessary registration cutoff. In the piece of legislation that was recently debated, there were a number of senators and representatives who had introduced amendments to eliminate this unnecessary voter voter registration cutoff, and implement election day registration. And unfortunately, that was not successful in the final piece of legislation, but it's a major piece of unfinished business. Massachusetts is the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. It's a very cool thing. We have the longest running constitution. We have a legislature that predates the United States. We have Supreme Judicial Court that has been operating continuously for centuries. And in many ways, democracy was born here in Massachusetts. And yet, on the critical issue of making our democracy safe and open and fair, we have fallen way behind a number of other states.
Yes, it's a great irony, isn't it, that this state of all states is the least transparent. Our what goes on in the State House is not at all transparent. And we have a lot of work to be done, maybe citizen groups protesting that.
I think that's entirely right. And so I would encourage folks to push for reform of some of these systems. One of the things that's at the forefront of my mind is moving forward with election day registration. Because, in particular, think about it during the pandemic. A lot of the opportunities that people have historically to interact with their government and to register, most of us are not going to the DMV these days. We're not going in person or interacting with as many government agencies. And so the state should really do more to make it easier for folks to register, because registering is really important to making sure that we increase the say of groups in our government. And I also think, I sort of started this conversation by talking about some of the racial biases in our system, because I think it's a real affront to our democracy that it's harder for people of color to register and vote. And I think that you see that in the effect of voter registration challenges. The people who are left out when you make it harder for people to register, harder for people to vote, are exactly the communities that have historically been subject to unfair rules in the voting space. And so I think we have a special duty to overcome those obstacles. And, I think there's a moment of awareness about racial disparities in policing. We're going through a moment where we're pushing for more reforms around the Black Lives Matter movement. We've had some good progress on criminal justice reform, and a lot more work to do in terms of disparities in sentencing and the ways that African Americans are treated within the criminal justice system. I think that there's a moment now to push for greater racial equity in voting. And I think that people should recognize some of the shadows of Jim Crow, of our shameful legacy of slavery, in the ways that our voting system fails to work for everybody right now. And it's a shame that one party has made a strategic decision to make it harder for certain communities to vote, because a lot of this is intentional, right? The Republican Party at the national level has made a decision that, in spite of the fact that they don't control the majority of voters, they do control the presidency of the U.S. Senate, the majority of governorships, the majority of state legislatures, and the courts. And one of the ways to perpetuate that power has been through gerrymandering, has been through voter suppression, has been through campaign finance rules that have been pushed by a court that has been stacked with conservative judges. And so what we're seeing is a system that is no longer as democratic as it ought to be. And the effect of that is to create a two-class system in which the group of people who has mobile voting is a group of historically disenfranchised folks. And so I think that there's a real moral necessity for us to be pushing for these reforms, as well as a practical necessity that we need to adjust our election systems to deal with the pandemic.
I know, I quite agree. And I think it is a strange moment in our lives. We have for so many years taken voting in this country for granted. We have just never thought that there would be any question at all. And I can recall thinking about other countries that had to have inspectors to make sure that voting was fair. And here we are in our own country. It seems that we can't take our institutions for granted. And
I think that's right. And I think, every day we're seeing more and more attacks on our constitutional structure. So, I mean, this weekend, President of the United States pardoned somebody who was, or commuted the sentence of somebody who was convicted by a jury of assisting the president in criminal activities. And, I sort of think about this, the old story about the frog that's in water and they increase the temperature of the water 1 degree at a time, and
Yes.
eventually the frog is boiling. I think that's what's happening with our democracy in many ways. And I think when you see the President of the United States with, to some extent, the complicity of the U.S. Senate minus Mitt Romney, who, by the way, has shown great integrity in standing up against the president, at least in the impeachment vote or on the Roger Stone commutation. But, you see a real set of challenges to our democracy when the U.S. Senate will not act as a check on even the most egregious corruption. And what that means is that ordinary citizens are going to need to be particularly vigilant to protect the institutions that we've relied on. So I think we're going through a stress test of our democracy.
Yes, we are.
That's unprecedented in our lifetime. And I think that this election holds a lot of that in the balance.
Yes, this election is absolutely critical if we are to preserve the democracy. But what now about these elections and correcting some of the egregious problems you've mentioned? What can individuals do? I'm thinking about people of Falmouth. We have a history of voluntarism and of activism. Can an individual do something to make a difference?
I think absolutely. So one of the things I pointed to that we've been talking about is being involved in your local elections as an election worker. So if you're available to volunteer to help on election day within the public system, there's a great need for folks to raise their hands and step forward and play that role. I'm a very strong believer in local government and activism. So I think that we're seduced by this notion of battleground states and that only 4 or 5 states ever matter. And I actually think that Falmouth matters a lot. Barnstable County matters a lot. Cape Cod and the islands matter a lot. And, I would encourage people to think about the things in their own communities that you can improve and be involved in, your local county commissioners races or your local state senate races or state representative races, town select board. Because I think, in a lot of ways, that's where the issues that affect people happen. And it's also where, in a lot of cases, people can have the most impact. So if you are a native of Cape and the Islands or the South Shore and you see some opportunities to improve what's going on in your own community, that's where I would start. There are opportunities to get involved in the national election. Voter Protection Corps is voter-protection.org. We certainly have a number of volunteer opportunities, mostly focused on the kinds of issues that we've been talking about here today. How do we identify the kinds of challenges that are likely to cause problems on election day, and what can we do now to try to head those problems off? And so we would love for folks to come and volunteer with us as well. Go to voter-protection.org and sign up, and we'll be in touch with you. But I would just encourage people to think about local opportunities. Think about election day opportunities, volunteer for a candidate you believe in. And also think about long-term strategies. So there was just a piece of legislation passed on Beacon Hill. There was, the governor signed it, but we're not done. There are lots of opportunities to promote democracy in the Commonwealth. And, I think that people should think about how can we improve it the next time? How can we make sure that there's election day registration? How can we make sure there's ranked choice voting? How can we make sure that there's early voting the weekend before the election? How can we make sure that the automatic voter registration system is implemented properly? There are a lot of opportunities to get involved, and this is a long-term problem, and we need to be involved in a sustained way in reclaiming our democracy.
And you think that the beginning is to concentrate on municipal government, local government.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that. Well, let me put it this way. I'm going to be a little partisan for a second. When I woke up the day after Donald Trump was elected, I was devastated, and I had to sit down and tell my children what had happened. But when we think about what that was, it wasn't just the presidency switching. So I had the great honor to work in the White House for President Barack Obama, and was very proud of what we were able to accomplish in that administration. And when the presidency shifted, it wasn't just the presidency shifted. It was, at the time they had the Senate and the House and the governorships and state legislatures and the courts. And if you think about how that happened, it was a process that goes back at least 2 decades, right? Maybe 3. The Christian Coalition, the Newt Gingrich and his revolution, the Tea Party. And Republicans did a very smart thing, which was they ran candidates for local offices, for down ballot offices. They ran candidates in races that they historically had not been competitive in. And they won some and they lost some, but what they did is they started to build up this farm system of younger people, of first-time candidates, and they used that, right? And they took over the state legislatures, they took over all these Secretary of State offices and Attorney General offices, and campaigns and offices that nobody focuses on, and they used that for some ends that I think have been very bad in history, such as gerrymandering, right? Redistricting in a way that concentrates power in certain offices. And when we think about how we're going to claw our way out of the really scary times that we're in, I think we need to take a long-term approach that's sort of based on that notion. We need to have young people running for office. We need more diverse candidates for office. We need women running for office. We need people who weren't interested in politics to get interested in politics, not just interested in, presidential politics, but interested in local politics and get engaged in their communities. And if you think about what it's going to take for us to kind of claw our way out of this mess, that's what it's going to be. It's going to be local activism. It's going to be diverse and first-time candidates. It's going to be reclaiming the government. It's going to be messy. But I think that's the answer. It's not a top-down, like, how are we going to fix the Democratic Party kind of a thing. It's going to be local activism. And so that's how I think people should think about it. If you haven't been interested in politics before, now's the time. Our futures are at stake. Our children's futures are at stake. You could not look for a time where the difference between the parties is any starker or where there's more at stake. So if you can't get interested in politics now, if you can't get engaged in your community now, you're probably not going to. But this is the time, I think, for people to get interested.
Yes, I see a role that some of us can play. For example, the League of Women Voters can work toward engaging younger people who somehow, I have the sense that a lot of younger people don't find local government particularly, shall I say, sexy. It seems much more exciting to be working on far-flung ideals at the national level or marching. So we need to, I've been talking to some young people recently, and I have the sense that they find it somehow local government is impenetrable, and it really isn't.
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing in some places that young people are getting involved in local government and making an impact. If you think about the things that really affect young people, let me just take 3 issues off the top of my head. The climate crisis, right, is a crisis right here in Falmouth and Cape Cod and the islands. It has a direct impact on both the standard of living and the economy here on Cape Cod and the islands. And, you think about the gun crisis, guns have a huge guns in schools, that's something that happens on the local level. Some of the solutions are local, some of them are national. If you think about college affordability and schools, those are often local issues as well. So I think that sort of drawing the issues that are going to affect the futures of young people and sort of drawing the line between how local government or state government can matter. Getting people interested in the issues that are going to affect them and their children and their grandchildren, because I think that that's a lot of what's at stake here. Is the question of what kind of a life are we going to leave to our children? Nowhere is that more true than the climate crisis. So I think there are a lot of issues, and sort of putting it in those terms is very compelling for people of all ages.
Yes, what you say makes a lot of sense, and I think that now is a great time for young people to become active in that, because the problems are so real. Do you think that when at the moment when we're free of the pandemic, whether some of the moves that are made now will turn out to be lasting improvements? For example, in voting, it may be that voting by mail will become the conventional way to vote. Do you see, looking into the future, do you see that?
I do think that we need to find some silver linings here. We need to, think about ways that we can take advantage of some of the challenges we're facing and turn them towards positive reforms. Certainly, mail-in voting would be one such reform. I think that there's some ways in which, for instance, technology can transform education, and maybe if there are investments in integrating technology into our schools, into our workplaces, there may be some positive benefits to that. But I'll say, I do think that this pandemic reflects a real crisis of leadership at almost every level, certainly at the federal level, that President Trump has failed us, has failed to set a national agenda, has failed to get ahead of this problem, but also, even when the problem was upon us, failed to demonstrate the kind of leadership that we needed at the national level for a coordinated response. And I think that we're starting to see the consequences of that failure of leadership. If you compare, say, some of the countries in Europe that were hit very hard by this pandemic, but took the important forward-looking steps to crush the curve. Some of those economies are reopening, and then we see real difficulties here in the United States with a resurgence of the pandemic. I'm quite worried that we're making some missteps here in Massachusetts. I know that Massachusetts has fared better recently. We were hit very hard with the pandemic and then fared a little bit better. I personally am quite worried about the move to reopen casinos and movie theaters and indoor dining, indoor gyms. I don't know if you know what the reproduction rate is, but it's the rate, if it's more than one, what it means is that each person will affect more than one person, and you have the danger of spiraling kind of geometric growth. Massachusetts recently flipped over to slightly more than one. A number of other Northeast states, so New York and New Jersey, have slowed down the reopening, particularly of indoor activities. And I'm worried that Massachusetts may be a little bit foolhardy in some of our recent move, particularly the indoor activities. I think are quite risky. And I say this understanding the pain that some of these businesses are feeling. But I think the real solution is that we actually should just raise some money to subsidize some of those businesses, and that the right answer is actually to pay some of the gyms and the casinos and the movie theaters and the restaurants, pay them to stay closed. Be generous to our workers, be generous to our businesses, but let's crush the curve, and then let's have a big plan for how we're going to reopen, and focus on really important things like how are we going to reopen the schools? How are we going to make sure that when we do reopen some of these indoor businesses, we can keep them open and we can keep people safe? Because I think at the end of the day, our economic recovery is really going to depend on whether we can get a handle on this pandemic. And I think all over the country, we're seeing that it's not under control. And I'm worried that we're being a little hasty here.
Yes, a second wave is certainly a worse scenario than we have right now when we're trying to simply not reopen and to be prudent. It seems to me, I think I agree with you about what could happen if we don't control the spread.
And I sure hope I'm wrong. I sure hope that, it's fine and we keep going in a good direction. I worry in particular about like movie theaters. Movie theaters seem like that's just sort of, I don't know why we're opening movie theaters.
Right, yes. And then the issue of schools as well. There is a lot of pressure at the federal level to reopen, and this is really foolhardy. So we have that as well. I wonder if the work of the Corps is, what does the Corps do for its funding? Is it
so? The Voter Protection Corps is a charitable entity. It's a 501c4 entity, and we've been engaged in fundraising for the last year or so, and have received some generous donations. Certainly, if any of your listeners want to make a donation, you can make it through the webpage voter-protection.org. But we've received generous donations from individuals and some larger institutions, and we're really focused on getting through November, and then we'll see from there. But we're fully funded through the election, and we can do more with more. But we're pleased that we have the resources to get through the election.
Well, we should encourage viewers to check your website, and let's have that again so that we'll post it. We'll certainly post it on the screen.
It's voter-protection.org.
All right, that's easy enough. And then more information is on that website for someone.
Absolutely. We'd love to have your viewers get involved. We certainly have volunteer opportunities, contribution opportunities, and lots of information about what we think are the challenges and what are the strategies that we can take on to overcome those challenges. Yes,
and are you optimistic?
I am optimistic I'm optimistic about this election, but I'm also optimistic in the medium to long term sense. I think that our democracy is in crisis. I think that this is the time when we need to stand up for it. This is the time we need to work hard to make sure this election is free and fair. But over time, I think that our society is changing, the demographics are changing, and I think that our democracy will prevail. And I think, if you look at the views of the next generation, even in the reddest of places, it's becoming more and more progressive on a number of issues. And I think I think the electoral map is going to change. I mean, you see, for instance, Texas is now a battleground state. And you're seeing some real changes in the Southwest in terms of where those votes are going to go. And I think that over time, it's going to be harder and harder for these voter suppression efforts to work. But I think in the short term, we shouldn't kid ourselves. I think this is a crisis of our democracy. I think that the Trump administration is assaulting our constitutional norms. And I don't think that we should kid ourselves about what we're up against.
Well, I thank you very much for both your words of encouragement and also for your words of warning. And I want to thank you so much for telling us about the important work that the Corps is doing. And
thank you so much. It's such a pleasure, Barbara. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and viewers, thank you for tuning in. We'll look forward to seeing you soon. And I also want to thank Marilyn Rowland, who makes these programs possible, and also to thank Falmouth Community Television, who is there for us with news and updates throughout this pandemic. So thank you, and see you all soon.